A man humiliated his poor mother in front of his new family. A week later, his regret was unavoidable. The wind gently blew over the barren fields of the small town where Christopher had grown up. Dry leaves crunched under his shoes as he walked home after finishing his duties at school. Although the day had been long, what awaited him at home always brought him comfort. The tireless figure of his mother, Beatrice, who, despite her exhaustion, always greeted him with a smile and a warm meal. Beatrice was the very embodiment of resilience. She worked from before dawn until late into the night, cleaning houses, selling food at the market, and doing any other job she could find. Everything, absolutely everything, was for Christopher. She knew her son was special, that he had a spark in his eyes that none of the other boys in town had. While the others resigned themselves to following in their parents' footsteps, Christopher dreamed of something more, and Beatrice, though tired, had no doubt that her son would break the cycle of poverty that had trapped them for generations. "Mom!" Christopher shouted as he crossed the small gate to the house, a worn-out old building full of warmth and memories. Beatrice was in the kitchen, moving swiftly among the pots, though her body bore the marks of years of hard work. "Here I am, son," she replied with her usual sweet voice. "I made your favorite meal today." Christopher smiled, but something inside him made him feel restless. Although he appreciated every gesture from his mother, he couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in the town, as if each day spent there was another step toward a future he didn't want. The atmosphere of the town suffocated him, with its endless fields and limited opportunities. He felt that if he didn't escape soon, he would end up like the other men there, worn out by a life of hard work with no reward. That night after dinner, Beatrice sat beside him. The small dining room in their home, dimly lit, had always been their refuge, the place where they shared their dreams and worries. Beatrice watched her son with pride, but she also noticed that something had changed in him. Christopher no longer spoke enthusiastically about life in the town or his small achievements at school. His mind was elsewhere. "Christopher, are you all right?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron, concerned about his prolonged silence. "You seem different lately." Christopher sighed. He knew he couldn't hide what he felt, not from his mother. She had always been his greatest support, his rock, but he also knew that what he was about to say would hurt her, even though it wasn't his intention. "I'm tired, Mom," he finally admitted, lifting his gaze to meet hers. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life here, trapped in this town. I want more. I want something different." Beatrice listened in silence, absorbing his words. Although her heart broke a little hearing that her son didn't want to follow the path she had known all her life, she also understood his ambition. Christopher wasn't like the others. He had the potential to go far beyond what anyone in that town could imagine. "I know, son," she finally said, stroking his face tenderly. "And I want you to have it all. I've worked hard so that you can have opportunities I never had. But don't forget where you come from, Christopher. No matter how humble this place is, it's a part of you." Christopher nodded, but in his mind he was already planning his escape. He knew his mother was right, but the urgency to leave that place consumed him more each day. That night, in his room, he promised himself he would do whatever it took to leave the town behind and achieve the successful life he so desperately desired. Weeks later, the news he had been waiting for finally arrived. He had won a scholarship to study at a prestigious university in the city. It was the escape ticket he had dreamed of, and although he was excited, he also felt a knot in his stomach when he thought about his mother. When he told Beatrice, she hugged him tightly, her eyes filled with tears of happiness and sadness. She knew this moment would come, that her son would leave to build a better life. But the fear of losing that special bond they shared lingered, silent but present. The day of his departure was bittersweet. At the bus station, Beatrice said goodbye to Christopher with a long, emotional hug, giving him one last piece of advice. "Remember who you are, Christopher. No matter where you go or how far you get, always remember where you come from." "I will, Mom," Christopher said, though deep down he was already disconnecting from that life. As the bus drove away, Beatrice stood there watching until it disappeared over the horizon. Her heart was filled with pride, but also with a growing emptiness. She knew her son's life was about to change forever, but she also feared that the physical distance would turn into something much deeper. That night, Christopher settled into the small apartment the university had provided. Everything was different. The life he had left behind seemed like a completely foreign world to what he was experiencing now. The city's lights, the endless opportunities, and the people he met, all from wealthy families, made him feel like he had finally found his place. Meanwhile, back in her humble home, Beatrice looked at an old photo of Christopher when he was a child. Despite the distance, her heart was full of love and pride. She told herself over and over again that all the effort, all the sacrifice would be worth it. She didn't know how much pain it would bring her in the future, but at that moment, her faith in Christopher was unshakable. Christopher quickly adapted to life in the city. Everything seemed bigger, faster, and definitely more luxurious. From the first day at the university, he realized that life here was different. He was no longer surrounded by the scarcity that had defined his life in the town. Instead, the halls were filled with young people wearing branded clothes, talking about trips abroad, and seemingly unaware of the struggles he knew all too well. Soon, Christopher began to change. He realized that if he wanted to fit into this new world, he had to leave behind every trace of his past. The calls and letters from Beatrice, which he had once answered eagerly, now felt like a burden. Every time he heard her voice or read her words, he felt they reminded him of the world he had desperately tried to escape. It was at one of the many university parties where Christopher met Alexandra. She was an elegant young woman, radiating confidence that drew everyone around her. Alexandra came from one of the wealthiest families in the city. Her father was a business magnate, and her mother, Isabella, was known for her sharp tongue and disdain for anyone not on her social level. Despite their different backgrounds, Alexandra was impressed by Christopher's ambition. He wasn't like the other boys in her circle who had everything without working for it. Christopher had hunger for success, and that made him stand out. For him, Alexandra represented everything he wanted: access to the elite world, a life free of the limitations he had experienced in his childhood. "So, where are you from?" Alexandra asked one night as they strolled through campus. Christopher hesitated for a second. He could tell the truth, but he had learned that in this world, the truth about his humble origins was not welcome. "From a small town," he finally responded, downplaying his answer. "Oh, and what do your parents do?" Alexandra seemed curious, but her tone had a hint of something that Christopher didn't like. He knew that if he mentioned his mother was a woman who cleaned houses and sold food at the market, his image would crumble before her. "My mother, she works, but what's important is that I'm here to make something big happen," Christopher said, steering the conversation towards his achievements and ambitions. From that moment on, Christopher began to blur the details of his life. Each time he talked about his past, he left out more and more until it almost seemed like someone else's story. Meanwhile, Beatrice continued to send him letters regularly, filled with love and support. But Christopher's responses became sporadic. His calls, brief and superficial, focused only on his career and how busy he was with his studies. Things started to get complicated when Alexandra invited Christopher to dinner with her family. That night, he was welcomed into an imposing mansion where marble floors and artwork covered every corner. The luxury was overwhelming, and Christopher felt that everything he had ever wanted was within reach. But the presence of Isabella, Alexandra's mother, made him feel constantly on edge. Isabella didn't bother hiding her skepticism towards Christopher. From the start, she saw him as someone who had gotten lucky, but who would never truly be one of them. Every comment, though veiled in courtesy, was laced with venom. "So, Christopher, where did you say you were from?" Isabella asked during dinner, her eyes coldly assessing him in a way Christopher couldn't ignore. "From a small town," Christopher repeated, uncomfortable, trying to stay calm. "Ah, right," Isabella smiled, but her gaze said something else. To her, Christopher was an outsider, someone trying to break into a world where he didn't belong. Despite the subtle jabs, Christopher remained determined. He knew that to be with Alexandra and enter this world, he would have to hide his past and play the game of appearances. But each time he did, he felt a small part of himself slipping further away from who he truly was. City life had completely consumed him, and Christopher was willing to pay the price, even if it meant distancing himself entirely from his mother. Beatrice hadn't seen Christopher in months. The letters she used to send him weekly now went unanswered, and when he did call, the conversations were brief, filled with formalities, and lacked the warmth they once had. Despite this, Beatrice held on to hope that her son was simply busy. She knew that Christopher was building a better life for himself, and though she missed him deeply, she reminded herself that all the sacrifice was worth it. Her love for him was unconditional, and she was willing to endure the emotional distance if it meant he would achieve his dreams. That morning, Beatrice woke up with a decision in mind. She couldn't keep waiting for a call or a letter. She wanted to see him, to hug him, and make sure he was all right. With her small bag of belongings in hand, and a gift she had spent weeks preparing, she decided to surprise him with a visit to the city. For months, she had saved every penny from selling food at the market and taking extra cleaning jobs. She knew she couldn't afford any luxuries, but she had saved enough for a bus ticket. Her heart was filled with hope as she prepared to see her son. Maybe he just needs a reminder, she thought to herself, trying to calm the anxiety growing in her chest. In her mind, she imagined the moment when Christopher would see her at his door, how he would smile upon seeing her after so long, and how they would spend the day together, reminiscing about old times. The trip to the city was long and exhausting, but Beatrice hardly noticed. Her mind was occupied with thoughts of her son, and the anticipation of seeing him made the hours fly by. When she finally arrived at the station, she took a moment to observe her surroundings. The city was imposing, filled with tall buildings and noisy streets. Everything was so different from her small town. Beatrice felt a little out of place, but she gathered her courage and started walking towards the address Christopher had given her in one of his earlier letters. After some time, she arrived at a house that looked like something out of a magazine. It was an impressive mansion, with huge windows and a perfectly manicured garden. Beatrice stood in front of the door, feeling smaller and smaller. She had heard about Christopher's life in the city, but seeing the scale of his success made her realize just how far her son had come. At that moment, she felt a mix of pride and nervousness. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her courage and rang the doorbell. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, the door slowly opened, and there stood a young, elegant woman with a look of surprise on her face. Beatrice immediately knew it was Alexandra, Christopher's wife. Although she had heard about her, she had never seen her in person. "Yes?" Alexandra said with a tense smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Alexandra's gaze traveled up and down Beatrice, evaluating every detail of her simple clothing and humble appearance. "Hello, I'm Beatrice, Christopher's mother," Beatrice said in a soft voice, trying to maintain her smile despite the growing discomfort under Alexandra's scrutiny. For a moment there was silence between them. Alexandra looked at Beatrice as if trying to comprehend how someone like her could be part of Christopher's life. Finally, with a slight nod, Alexandra stepped aside. "Oh, of course, come in," she said with strained politeness as she gestured for Beatrice to enter. Beatrice stepped inside, marveling at the opulence surrounding her. The marble floors gleamed under her feet, and the walls were adorned with expensive paintings she didn't understand. Every corner of the house screamed luxury and wealth. As she followed Alexandra, Beatrice felt like she was in a completely foreign world. Everything was cold, perfect, distant, so different from the warm and modest home she had shared with Christopher for so many years. Alexandra led her to a large living room, where every piece of furniture seemed more expensive than Beatrice's entire house. The discomfort grew inside her, but she tried not to show it. She sat at the edge of a plush armchair, holding her small gift with trembling hands, anxiously waiting for her son's arrival. "Christopher should be home soon," Alexandra commented distantly before leaving the room. Beatrice was left alone in the enormous space, feeling how time seemed to stretch out. She felt out of place, as if she didn't belong in that house or the life her son had built. But despite it all, she held on to hope. After all, Christopher was her son. The love they shared was strong, or at least she believed it to be. A few minutes later, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, followed by Christopher's voice. "Alexandra, are you here?" Beatrice's heart leaped. Finally, she would see her son after all this time. She stood up from the chair, a nervous smile on her face. Christopher walked into the living room, and for a moment, their eyes met. At first, his expression was one of surprise, but it quickly shifted to discomfort. "Mom," he said, trying to hide his unease. He hadn't expected to see her, especially not at his house, without notice. He didn't know how to handle the situation. "Hello, son. I decided to come visit you. I've missed you so much," Beatrice said, stepping toward him with the gift in her hands. Before Christopher could respond, Isabella, Alexandra's mother, entered the room. Impeccably dressed, with a critical gaze, Isabella observed the scene with interest. Her eyes landed on Beatrice, and an arrogant smile formed on her lips. "Oh, Christopher, you didn't mention your mother was visiting," Isabella said in a tone that barely concealed her disdain. The atmosphere in the room immediately became tense. Beatrice could feel the coldness in Isabella's words and realized she was not welcome in that house. "It was a surprise," Christopher replied, avoiding direct eye contact with his mother. He knew he shouldn't be ashamed of her. But at that moment, under Isabella's scrutinizing gaze, he couldn't help it. The conversation over the next tour was awkward. Beatrice tried to participate, but every comment she made was met with tense silences or short responses from Alexandra and Isabella. Christopher, unable to find a way to mediate the situation, felt trapped. Alexandra barely spoke, and Isabella seized every opportunity to make snide remarks about Christopher's humble background, all with a smile on her face. "It's admirable how Christopher has achieved so much coming from so little," Isabella said at one point, casting a pointed glance at Beatrice. The pain on Beatrice's face was evident, but she remained silent, too proud to openly confront Alexandra's mother. The worst part was when Christopher didn't defend Beatrice. Instead of stopping the humiliations, Christopher just smiled uncomfortably, wishing the visit would end as soon as possible. With a broken heart, Beatrice realized that her son was further away from her than she had ever imagined. When the dinner finally ended, Beatrice knew she couldn't stay any longer. There had been no reunion, no warm words, no connection she had hoped for. Before leaving, she left the small gift she had brought for Christopher, a simple hand-embroidered piece, a symbol of all the love she felt for him. "This is for you, son. I just wanted to remind you where you come from," she said, placing the gift on the table. Christopher didn't know what to say. Beatrice looked at him one last time, her eyes filled with sadness, and bid him a gentle farewell. Alexandra and Isabella barely acknowledged her as she left, and Christopher, paralyzed by his own shame, let her go without saying anything meaningful. As Beatrice stepped out of the house, the weight of the pain overwhelmed her. She knew she had lost her son, not physically, but emotionally, and that loss was what hurt the most. The journey back to the village was silent, but inside Beatrice, a storm of emotions raged without mercy. The rattling of the bus seemed to beat in time with her pain. Each mile that took her further from the city not only increased the physical distance between her and Christopher, but also widened the emotional gap that had formed between them. She stared out the window, but didn't see the scenery. Her mind was trapped in the moments of that cold dinner, where Isabella and Alexandra's words had been like knives. However, what hurt most wasn't their insults. It was her son's passivity, Christopher's silence, as they humiliated her. When did he change so much? She asked herself over and over again. The Beatrice that everyone knew was a strong woman, used to adversity. She had faced life with dignity, never complaining, but now she felt like a part of her had been shattered. It was as if she had lost something she could never recover. She tried to justify her son's behavior, telling herself that maybe Christopher was trapped in a world he didn't understand. Maybe he felt pressured to fit in with that society. Maybe he thought that defending her would make him look weak in front of his wife and mother-in-law. But no matter how hard she tried to find a reason to excuse his actions, the pain remained, throbbing deep inside. When she finally arrived in the village, everything seemed emptier. The streets that had once brought her comfort now seemed bleak and sad. Beatrice greeted her neighbors with a tired smile, trying to hide her suffering. She didn't want anyone to know what had happened. Her pride wouldn't let her show that the son she had given everything for, the son she had sacrificed every part of her life for, had betrayed her in the worst way. Meanwhile, in the city, Christopher tried to go on with his life, but something inside him wasn't right. The first few hours after his mother left, he tried to convince himself that everything had gone well, that his mother understood how busy he was, and that the situation had been awkward but would pass. But that night, as he lay in bed, the images from the dinner wouldn't leave his mind. His mother's face, with that forced smile as she tried to engage in a conversation that excluded her, kept appearing every time he closed his eyes. He felt a knot in his stomach as he remembered how he had avoided looking at her when Isabella made her sarcastic comments. He knew he had failed, but he didn't want to confront it. His ambition and desire to fit into Alexandra's world had blinded him. However, now that he was alone in the darkness, the weight of what he had done began to settle on him. The next morning, as Alexandra and Isabella carried on with their usual lives talking about social events and business, Christopher found himself distracted. He couldn't focus on the conversations or his work. It was as if a constant voice in his mind reminded him of his betrayal. When Alexandra casually mentioned that his mother had seemed pleasant, considering where she came from, something inside Christopher snapped. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Alexandra looked at him, surprised by his reaction. "I just said your mother was more polite, that's all." Christopher clenched his fists under the table. He knew his wife didn't mean it maliciously, but every comment about his mother carried a condescension that pushed him to the edge. Alexandra didn't understand what his mother had been through, the sacrifices she had made, or the dignity with which she had always faced life. And worst of all, Christopher realized he had stopped appreciating it too. Over the next few days, the guilt inside him grew like a shadow he couldn't escape. Every shallow conversation he had with Alexandra or Isabella made him feel more distant from his true identity, from his roots, and most of all from his mother. He tried to drown those thoughts with work, but nothing worked. The image of his mother leaving his house, her eyes sad, and the gift she had left on the table, haunted him relentlessly. Finally, one afternoon, as Christopher was reviewing some papers in his office, the guilt became unbearable. He let the documents fall onto the desk and stood up abruptly, feeling like the air in the room was suffocating him. He knew he had crossed a line, that he had betrayed the only person who had always believed in him, even when he had stopped believing in himself. "I have to call her," he muttered to himself, reaching for his phone. He grabbed the device, but when he opened his contact list and found his mother's number, something stopped him. What was he going to say? How was he going to apologize for what he had done? The weight of his shame was so heavy that the words stuck in his throat. He closed his eyes, remembering how his mother had always told him to be honest, to face his mistakes with courage. But in that moment, his courage failed him. He didn't make the call. Meanwhile, Beatrice tried to return to normal life in the village, but nothing felt the same. Every day, as she worked at the market or cleaned houses, her mind kept returning to that dinner at Christopher's house. She felt a void in her chest that she couldn't fill, a sense of loss that wouldn't go away. Despite everything, she held no resentment. Beatrice was still the same generous and loving woman she had always been. She knew Christopher was trapped in a world she didn't understand, one that likely pressured him to act in ways even he wouldn't recognize. "He'll come back, I know. He just needs time," Beatrice told herself, trying to convince herself that everything would get better. But deep down in her heart, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost her son forever. As the days passed, Beatrice's face grew dimmer, more sad. Her neighbors noticed, but she always had a kind smile and an encouraging word for them. She never spoke of what had happened. Despite everything, her pride wouldn't let her show that pain. Each day was a silent battle to keep her dignity intact while her heart slowly broke. However, Beatrice couldn't foresee that the real tragedy was about to strike in an even more devastating way. One day, while walking to one of her cleaning jobs in a nearby city, a distracted driver didn't see her crossing the street. The impact was brutal. Beatrice fell to the ground, and everything went black. Witnesses rushed to her side, but they knew the injuries were severe. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived and rushed her to the hospital. The following hours were critical. Doctors fought to stabilize her, but the internal injuries were severe. Beatrice was left in a coma, and her future was uncertain. Christopher was in his office when he received the call that would change his life. At first, when he heard the doctor's voice, he thought it was a mistake or maybe a minor accident. But when the doctor explained the seriousness of the situation, something inside Christopher broke. "My mother, in a coma." His voice trembled, unable to process the information. The weight of reality crashed down on him with a force that left him breathless. All the times he had ignored her calls, the letters he never responded to, and above all, the way he had treated her during her visit, all of it hit him at once. He realized that his mother might die without him ever having the chance to make things right. Desperate, he dropped everything and rushed to the hospital. During the drive, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The images of his mother at the dinner, her pained expression as he remained silent, played over and over in his head. How had he allowed success and money to blind him so much? How had he betrayed the person who loved him the most, all for the sake of fitting into a world that didn't really matter? When he arrived at the hospital, the doctor met him with a grave expression. "Your mother is in a coma, sir. We've done everything we can, but her condition is critical. We don't know if she'll wake up." Christopher collapsed in the waiting room, unable to hold back the tears. For the first time in a long time, the weight of his decisions crushed him completely. He had lost his way, he had forgotten what truly mattered in life, and now when he finally realized his mistake, it might be too late to fix it. The sound of the monitors in the intensive care room was constant, a mix of beeping and humming that filled the air with an overwhelming coldness. Christopher sat by his mother's bedside, unable to take his eyes off her pale and fragile face. Beatrice, who had always been so strong, so full of life, now lay motionless, connected to machines that kept her body functioning, but with no guarantee that she would wake up. The weight of guilt was becoming more unbearable with each passing moment. Christopher had been in the hospital for hours, but time seemed to stretch endlessly. Every second that passed, the regret deepened in his heart. He couldn't stop replaying the last time he had seen his mother, that dinner at his house when he had allowed her to be humiliated in front of his wife and mother-in-law. He hadn't had the courage to defend her, and now as he stared at her motionless body, he realized he might never get the chance to make things right. Christopher took Beatrice's hand, noticing how cold it felt. It seemed almost impossible that this was the same hand that had cared for him for so many years, that had held him during his most vulnerable moments. He felt the words catch in his throat, as if an invisible barrier was stopping him from speaking. But he knew he had to say something, even if his mother couldn't hear him. "Forgive me, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Forgive me for everything." Tears began to slide down his face. He didn't bother wiping them away. He knew that no matter how many times he asked for forgiveness, the words would never be enough to fix the damage he had caused. He had let ambition and the desire for success turn him into someone he no longer recognized. For years, he had tried to leave behind his roots, to shed his humble past, and in the process, he had abandoned the one person who had always loved him unconditionally. "You gave me everything, Mom, and everything, and I didn't know how to value it." His voice broke as he spoke. It was the first time he allowed himself to be completely honest with himself. The days following the accident were a whirlwind of emotions. Christopher barely left the hospital, waiting desperately for any sign that his mother would show improvement. Meanwhile, the pressure from his life in the city continued to mount. His boss had sent him several concerned messages about his absence, and Alexandra had visited the hospital once, but her visit had been brief and distant. She seemed uncomfortable, as if she didn't know how to handle the situation. "I hope your mother gets better soon, but you know you have to go back to work at some point, right?" Alexandra had said one day, as she was leaving. Christopher nodded, but his thoughts were far from the office. He knew there were responsibilities to fulfill, but nothing mattered more at that moment than his mother's life. Every time he saw Alexandra, he felt an increasing disconnection between them. It wasn't just because of the situation they were in, but because deep down Christopher knew their relationship was built on appearances. Now, everything seemed superficial and empty. When Alexandra left, Leaving behind the lingering scent of her expensive perfume, Christopher remained alone in the waiting room. Around him, other families were waiting for news of their loved ones, some with hope, others with faces full of sorrow. Christopher realized that despite all the success he had achieved, he felt more alone than ever. It was then that he saw David, his childhood friend, walking into the room. Christopher hadn't seen him in years. David still lived in the village, struggling every day to get by with what little he had. But despite the hardships, David had never stopped being an honest and loyal person, qualities that Christopher had come to appreciate now that everything else seemed to be falling apart. "David!" Christopher stood up, surprised by his presence. "I heard what happened to your mother. I came as soon as I could," David said, his expression filled with genuine concern. David sat next to Christopher, and for a few minutes they both remained silent. David didn't need to say much. His simple presence was already a comfort to Christopher, who felt overwhelmed by the situation. Despite the distance that had grown between them over the years, David was still the same loyal friend Christopher had known in their childhood. "Thank you for coming," Christopher finally said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Your mother is a good woman. Everyone in the village loves her. I know what's happened between you two, but she never stopped speaking about you with pride. She always said that even though you were busy, you were a good son." David's words were like a dagger in Christopher's heart. He knew his mother had defended him even when he didn't deserve it, even when he had forgotten and neglected her. "I've been an idiot, David," Christopher admitted, lowering his head. "I treated her so badly. I let her be humiliated in my own house, and I didn't even have the courage to defend her. And now—" He trailed off, unable to continue speaking. David placed a hand on Christopher's shoulder, offering silent support. "Look, I don't know what's going to happen, but your mother is strong. And if you get the chance to make things right, do it. Don't let regret consume you, brother." Christopher nodded, grateful for his friend's words. He knew David was right. He couldn't remain paralyzed by guilt. He had to find a way to redeem himself, to make amends if his mother woke up. And if she didn't, then he would have to live with the weight of that regret for the rest of his life. Before leaving, David handed Christopher a small envelope. "Your mother asked me to give you this a few days ago before all this happened. She said it was important." David handed it to him with a serious expression. Christopher took the envelope, and when he opened it, he found a letter written in his mother's careful handwriting. As he read it, the tears returned to his eyes. In the letter, Beatrice spoke of how proud she was of him, of how she had always known he would achieve great things. But what struck him the most was that there wasn't a single mention of the pain she had felt during her visit. There were no reproaches, no resentment. Instead, Beatrice asked him to always remember where he came from, to never let success distance him from his values, and to never forget the lessons she had taught him from a young age. The letter was a testament to his mother's unconditional love. Despite everything that had happened, she still believed in him. "Dear Christopher, sometimes life takes us down paths we don't always understand. I know you've distanced yourself from your life in the village, and that's okay. I knew you would one day, because you've always been a dreamer, and I never wanted you to feel trapped. I'm proud of everything you've accomplished, even if I haven't always told you in person. It hurts that we've become so distant, but I always believed that one day we would find our way back to each other. I don't blame you for anything, son. I just want you to remember one thing. No matter how far you go, always keep your heart rooted in love and humility. Success means nothing if you lose your essence. With all my love, Mom." Christopher felt the tears fall as he read the letter. His mother had never judged him, even after everything that had happened. Instead, she had continued to show him love and understanding, even when he had failed her in so many ways. The letter was a reminder of everything Beatrice had always represented: emotional strength and unconditional love that had never wavered, not even in the darkest moments. Christopher collapsed into the chair, holding the letter against his chest as the tears fell freely. He knew he had failed in many ways, but his mother's letter gave him the strength to fight for redemption. If she could still love him despite everything, then he had to do the same. Learn to forgive himself and find a way to become the man she had always believed he could be. The days that followed were a test of patience and faith. Christopher stayed by his mother's side, waiting for any sign that she would wake up. With every visit from David, his support was unwavering, reminding Christopher that he wasn't alone in this process. Despite the severity of the situation, the atmosphere slowly began to fill with hope. Christopher knew that no matter what happened, he could no longer live the way he had before. Life had given him a harsh lesson, and now he had the chance to change. And although he couldn't erase what he had done, he could try to live in a way that honored his mother's sacrifices and love. 2 days later, the fluorescent lights in the hospital shone with the same intensity as they had for days, but for Christopher, time had started to blur. Every hour passed in a mix of pain, guilt, and regret. The daily visits from David and the doctor's words of encouragement had brought some comfort, but the weight of uncertainty remained overwhelming. Christopher had barely left the hospital since receiving his mother's letter. He spent hours sitting by her bedside, speaking to her in a low voice, even though there was no response. He wanted her to know, if she woke up, that she hadn't been alone, that he had been there to redeem himself. He knew he couldn't change the past, but each day spent by her side was an opportunity to show her that he was willing to change, that he wanted to be better, not just for her, but for himself. One afternoon, as the rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds in the room, Christopher noticed something different in his mother's breathing. He leaned forward, his heart pounding, as he watched her closely. "Mom," he whispered, hoping that this time she would hear him. For a few seconds there was no response, but then, with a faint movement, Beatrice's eyelids fluttered as if she were trying to open her eyes. Christopher felt a wave of emotion and fear at the same time. He pressed the button to call the doctors, but he didn't move away from his mother. Beatrice blinked slowly, and though her eyes seemed confused, they finally opened, finding her son's gaze. "Mom!" Christopher's voice broke as he took Beatrice's hand in his, feeling his heart race. "I'm here. I'm here, Mom." The doctors quickly entered the room and began checking her vital signs, while Christopher stepped aside slightly, never taking his eyes off her. In the next few minutes, the doctors confirmed that Beatrice had come out of the coma, though her condition was still delicate. They couldn't say how long it would take for her to fully recover, but the fact that she had woken up was already a miracle in itself. "She's had a very slow recovery, but this is a good sign," one of the doctors said, looking at Christopher. "However, she'll need time and constant care. It's still too early to say how complete her recovery will be, but she's made it. Your mother is a fighter." Christopher nodded, grateful for the doctor's words, but his attention was completely focused on Beatrice. Her eyes still held confusion, but there was also a light, a spark of life that filled him with hope. The following weeks were marked by a slow but steady recovery. Beatrice, though weak, began to speak little by little, and every word she spoke was a relief to Christopher. He stayed by her side every day, helping her with whatever she needed, making sure she never felt alone. One day, while Beatrice was sleeping, Alexandra arrived at the hospital. Her elegant demeanor and expensive perfume contrasted with the cold, sterile environment of the hospital. Christopher greeted her with a tired smile, but quickly noticed the tension in his wife's face. She hadn't come to offer comfort, but something entirely different. "Christopher, we need to talk," Alexandra said, crossing her arms. Christopher sighed. He knew this conversation had been looming, and although he didn't want to face it at that moment, he understood that he could no longer avoid it. "Go ahead, Alexandra," he responded, his voice calm but firm. "You can't stay here forever," she began with a tone of impatience. "You've been here for weeks, and I understand that you're worried about your mother, but you also have responsibilities. Our work, our life in the city, everything is waiting. We can't keep going like this." Christopher looked at her, noticing how every word she spoke was laced with coldness. Alexandra didn't understand what he was going through, and the worst part was that she didn't even seem to try. "Do you really think that's what's important right now?" Christopher asked, incredulity creeping into his voice. His patience, which he had maintained until then, was starting to wear thin. "My mother is here, fighting for her life, and you're talking about work and responsibilities as if that's more important." You don't understand, Alexandra replied, her tone rising. We can't put our life on hold for this. My mother is worried too. She says you're leaving everything behind for a situation that, frankly, shouldn't be controlling you this much. Christopher, we have to move forward. Alexandra's words hit Christopher like a punch to the gut. Had it really come to this? Had he allowed his relationship with Alexandra to become so empty, so disconnected from what truly mattered? Leaving everything behind? Christopher stood up, his gaze intense and determined. Do you know what I've left behind, Alexandra? I've left behind the only person who has always been there for me, who gave everything without asking for anything in return. And do you know why? Because I got caught up in this life we built, a life based on appearances and ambition. But not anymore. Alexandra looked at him, surprised by the firmness in his words. She had expected an argument, but not such a direct de-Beatrician. Christopher, however, wasn't finished. My mother is the most important thing right now, and not just now while she's sick. She always was, but I was too blind to realize it. I'm not going to leave her alone again, so if you think that our work or whatever you think is so urgent is more important than her, you're wrong. Christopher, you're exaggerating, Alexandra tried to interrupt, but Christopher didn't stop. No, I'm not, he responded firmly. I'm seeing things clearly for the first time in a long time, and if that means you and I no longer share the same values, then I think we have nothing left to do together. Alexandra took a step back, processing his words. The discomfort on her face was evident. For her, everything revolved around status, image, and success, and seeing Christopher step away from that world was incomprehensible. What are you saying? She finally asked, her voice filled with disbelief. I'm saying this is over, Alexandra, Christopher said with a calmness that even surprised him. Our marriage has been built on something false, on something superficial, and now I realize that it's not what I want. I can't keep living like this. Alexandra stared at him, her eyes filled with shock and anger. She had never imagined that Christopher would end their relationship like this, much less over his mother. I can't believe you're doing this to me, Alexandra whispered, shaking her head. You're ruining everything for someone who doesn't even have a future. Christopher felt those words cut into his soul, but instead of crumbling, he stood his ground. She's my mother, and I'll never let anyone look down on her again. If that ruins our life together, then so be it. Alexandra, still in disbelief, said nothing more. She turned and walked out of the hospital, leaving behind the echo of her heels resonating through the empty halls. Christopher watched her leave, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. He knew it was the end of something, but it was also the beginning of a new life, one where he wouldn't be led by ambition or appearances. Days later, as Beatrice began to regain some strength, Christopher sat by her bedside, determined to have the conversation he had been avoiding for so long. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. Mum, I need you to listen to me, he said, gently taking her hand. What I did to you, everything I allowed to happen, there's no excuse for how I treated you. I was selfish, blind, and I let success and ambition drive me away from you. I left you alone when you needed me the most, and I can't forgive myself for that. Beatrice looked at him, still weak but with a serene expression in her eyes. Her love for him hadn't changed, not even after everything that had happened. It doesn't matter, Christopher, she said in a soft voice, her words filled with infinite tenderness. I know you, son. I always knew you'd find your way back. I knew that sooner or later, you'd realize what really matters. Tears began to well up in Christopher's eyes. He had hoped for forgiveness, but not so quickly and without conditions. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me. I was a fool to push you away to try and hide who I am. But that's changed. I can't erase my mistakes, but I want to show you that I can be the son you deserve. Beatrice smiled softly, squeezing Christopher's hand with the little strength she had. You already are, Christopher. You have been since the day you were born. Her words, though simple, filled Christopher with a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew that while the road to redemption would be long, he had taken the first step, and most importantly, he knew that his mother would always be by his side, no matter how far he had fallen. For the rest of the afternoon, Christopher and Beatrice talked not only about the past, but about the future. Beatrice remained the strong and generous woman she had always been, and though her body was weak, her spirit was unbroken. Christopher, on the other hand, had made the decision to leave behind the life he had built in the city. He no longer cared about luxury or unchecked ambition. All he wanted was to be close to his mother, reconnect with his roots, and perhaps find a way to help others, to do something meaningful with his life. The first step toward redemption had been taken, and although the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Christopher knew he wouldn't be walking it alone. The air in the village had a different scent than that of the city. Christopher hadn't noticed it in years, but now, being back, everything felt more real, more authentic. He had spent too much time living in a superficial world, chasing success and validation from people who never truly mattered to him. But now, back in the place where he had grown up, he felt like he was finally where he belonged. After Beatrice's recovery, they both decided to return to the village so she could rest at home. She was still weak and needed constant care, but her determination to keep moving forward hadn't diminished. Christopher made sure everything was set up for her comfort, and he planned to stay by her side for as long as necessary. He would never leave her alone again. "It's strange being back," Christopher said as he drove towards the house where he had spent his childhood. "Everything looks the same, but at the same time, different." Beatrice, sitting in the passenger seat, smiled weakly. "The village doesn't change much, son. It's us who change with time." Beatrice's words resonated deeply in Christopher's heart. She had always been a wise woman, able to see things with clarity and perspective, something he had lost in his fast-paced city life. As he drove through the familiar streets, he noticed the faces of the neighbors were the same, though some bore the marks of time. When they finally arrived at Beatrice's house, Christopher stood in front of the door for a moment, remembering the times he had come and gone from this home, filled with dreams and ambitions. But this time, as he crossed the threshold, he felt like he was stepping in with a new mindset. He now understood that success wasn't measured by money or prestige, but by love, true relationships, and being present for those who truly mattered. The first days back in the village were peaceful. Christopher devoted himself to taking care of his mother, ensuring she lacked nothing. Meanwhile, Beatrice, though still recovering, began to resume some of her old routines. Sometimes, when she had enough energy, she would walk to the market to greet the neighbors. Everyone was happy to see her back and offered her words of support and affection. One day, while Christopher was repairing a part of the house's roof, David showed up, just as he had at the hospital. This time, however, there was something different in his expression. He was carrying a folder under his arm, and although his smile was relaxed, Christopher could tell that David had something in mind. "You've turned into a real countryman again," David said, grinning at Christopher with a playful smile. "More or less," Christopher replied, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Though I'm not as good at it as I used to be." David laughed and then handed him the folder. "I've got something for you. Well, for both of us." Christopher looked at him curiously as he took the folder and opened it. Inside were several documents about a plot of land in the village and a business proposal to open a small community store. David had mentioned the idea before, during one of their conversations at the hospital, but now it seemed he had taken it a step further in his planning. "Is this what I think it is?" Christopher asked, glancing through the documents. "Exactly. It's the idea I had a while ago. I want to open something that can help the village, a place where people can buy local products, essential things, without having to rely on the high prices of big stores. You know, something that benefits everyone." Christopher was silent for a moment, looking at the documents and his friend's detailed plans. It was simple, but had a clear purpose: to help the community. That, he thought, was what really mattered now. He no longer wanted to build empires or climb the social ladder. What he wanted was to contribute in a meaningful way, and David was offering him just that. "What do you think?" David asked, unable to hide his nervousness. "I know it's not a big enterprise or anything like that, but I think we could do something good here." Christopher closed the folder and smiled at his friend with genuine warmth. "I think it's a great idea, David, and I want to do it with you." David burst out laughing, relieved, and gave him a hearty pat on the back. "I knew I could count on you, brother." That night, Christopher sat with Beatrice on the porch of the house, enjoying the cool breeze that swept through the village. Beatrice, still weak but more peaceful than ever, looked out at the horizon with serenity. Her face reflected the contentment of someone who had lived a full life and was now witnessing her son finally finding his way back to what truly mattered. "David told me about a project in the village," Christopher said, gazing out at the horizon. "I think it could be something good for everyone. It's small, but meaningful." Beatrice smiled, nodding slowly. "I always knew you'd find your way, son. Sometimes we need to lose ourselves a bit to see things clearly." Christopher sighed, reflecting on everything that had happened over the past few months. He had lost so much chasing an empty dream, but now, being back in the place where it all began, he felt like he had found something far more valuable. He was at peace with his decision to leave the city behind and focus on the things that truly mattered. "I want to stay here, Mom," he finally said, with a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "I want to stay to take care of you, to help David, and to build something that really matters. No more luxuries or senseless ambitions. I just want to live an honest life." Beatrice took her son's hand, and though she said nothing, her smile said it all. She knew Christopher had changed, that he had learned the most important lesson of all, the value of relationships, love, and humility. "You're already everything I ever wanted you to be, Christopher," she said in a soft but firm voice. "And I know you'll do wonderful things here, where you truly belong." The sky above them began to darken, but in Christopher's heart everything was clear. He had found his place, not in the tall buildings of the city, but in the small streets of the village, in his mother's embrace, and in the unwavering friendship of David. And though the journey hadn't been easy, he knew that what mattered wasn't the destination, but the path he had taken to get there. Christopher had made peace with his past, and now, with the serenity that only comes from acceptance and love, he was ready to start anew from scratch, but this time with a true foundation. The next morning was crisp and the sky was clear over the small village. The birds chirped softly, and the scent of wet earth mingled with that of wildflowers. Christopher walked slowly along the gravel path leading to the field behind his mother's house, a place he had frequented as a child. Each step brought him closer to his memories, and with each one, he felt his heart fill with a serenity he hadn't experienced in years. It was the end of a long journey, one filled with unexpected twists, painful mistakes, and difficult lessons, but also with unconditional love, true friendship, and redemption. And that's the end of Christopher's powerful journey of redemption. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe for more emotional stories like this, and comment on which part impacted you the most.